Hello everybody, welcome to Little Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel and drop a like on this video. We are talking about Zion Williamson in today's video because all reports seem to indicate that the New Orleans Pelicans intend on trading Zion this offseason. Now, before we get into any potential trade destinations, I do want to point out that I think this is a bad idea. I understand where they're coming from, given that Zion's strong play towards the end of the year was very encouraging for a lot of reasons, and you can look at that as your way out of this situation. He's flashed enough potential to once again probably trick at least one NBA franchise into buying into that potential despite the massive risks. So we use this as the opportunity to offload him from the team. I understand why they have that perspective. However, this is also the New Orleans Pelicans. This is one of the smallest market franchises in the entire NBA. This is the type of team that, well, I was actually going to say they don't really see generational talent, but they kind of do. They had Chris Paul initially, and then eventually Anthony Davis, who maybe he didn't end up being quite a generational talent, if you want to be really strict about that definition, but at the very least a generational prospect. He was one of the more hyped prospects the game had seen at that time period in the NBA, and they managed to blow both of those opportunities, and this time around it's less their fault. But I think selling high on Zion right now would be a mistake because whatever you get back, it's not going to be as good as what a healthy Zion for an even remotely prolonged period of time would look like. However, I completely understand that the current evidence would suggest that that's just not going to happen. But we did get a 70-game season out of him fairly recently, and he looked physically as good as he ever has in the NBA in this previous year. And I personally feel holding on to him and seeing what he can do next season is worth the risk that what he does next season is turn his trade value into nothing. I would rather take that risk, see what can happen on a more positive end of things than completely throw out the possibility of that positive just because you feel like it's unlikely. If this was a different franchise, if this was one that had a lot of positive things going otherwise, then I'd be all over it. But the Pelicans really aren't in that situation. They do have young players that are interesting. You know, Trey Murphy III just had a 20-point per game season. Herb Jones is a really, really damn good defensive player, probably arguably the best perimeter defender in the entire NBA, certainly has a case for it. DeJounte Murray coming off of an ACL tear is whatever. You traded Brandon Ingram for chips. Like, you just don't have a lot going on here other than what you could have going on if Zion's great. And I feel like trading him is just a little silly. But I also understand it, but I also feel like they shouldn't do it. It's kind of an unwinnable damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because the odds are higher than not that if you held on to Zion, it wouldn't work in your favor. But I also think the odds are higher than not that trading him now wouldn't yield nearly the result that even the 20% potential that he would land on his feet works out. Even that potential, I think, is worth taking the risk on more than the more security in the knowledge that you're gonna be bad and get mid assets back from Zion. Like, I just don't think there's a lot positive here other than, of course, the salary cap situation that you're saving yourself from. But Zion has a bunch of different incentives in his contract determined by games played and weight and all of those factors. But also, it's not like the Pelicans haven't been able to sign some major free agent because Zion wasn't available, or they weren't, or it was because Zion was taking up that salary. It's not like they were, right away from turning this team into a contender, but then Zion took all the stupid money. No, that's not what's happening here. The Pelicans are still very far from a team that's locked into a crazy amount of money. There's a lot of contracts on this team that can very easily be moved if necessary. So I don't think the financial reason is that great of a justification. And I also don't think you're selling that high on him, higher than his value would have been a couple of months ago, but still not nearly as high as you would like it to be for a guy who you drafted to be your franchise player. But with that said, I've ranted about the Pelicans themselves long enough. Let's just go over a couple of teams that could potentially have interest in trading for Zion Williamson, and we can loosely discuss trade packages, however, not specifics. Specifics are hard to do on the fly. First things first, I really hope it's an Eastern Conference team. I will probably make a longer form, maybe even a deep dive video about it at some point, but the conference balance in the NBA is so bad right now, and the fact that there's a good chance Giannis is heading to the Western Conference only makes that all the more true. So let's start in the East. A big team that stands out to me is the Atlanta Hawks. They're a team that could definitely make the salary work. They have a couple of young prospects they can throw in there. I believe they have most of their future draft capital. They might have a pick that's still tied up in the DeJounte Murray trade after all these years, but I think that's already passed on. But if it hasn't, I still think they're not in like Stepien rule territory to where they can't trade a draft pick at all. So they have picks to trade, they have young players to trade, and you have contracts that you can use to potentially match it. They also have some money coming off of the books this offseason. So if you wanted to get a pick and roll partner for Trae Young or a fast break partner for Trae Young, can't think of a much better one than a healthy Zion. And I have kind of always wanted Trae Young and Zion to play together because Trae is one of the best lob passers in the entire NBA, and Zion is, of course, great at catching alley-oops because of his athleticism. I would love to see this duo happen. In fact, I actually like that idea so much I'd prefer it to Zion staying on the Pelicans. But I was talking about what would be smart for the Pelicans in the intro, not necessarily what I want. There could be some more interesting stuff. Immediately after that, the Charlotte Hornets, a similar situation. LaMelo Ball setting up Zion. Great combination there. I do feel like LaMelo is a little less polished as a playmaker and scorer than Trae is. He's a little bit worse as a result, but I think LaMelo could elevate Zion's game, and by virtue of having just such a dominant scoring threat on the floor, it would also free up LaMelo to be all the more capable as a scorer because of less defensive pressure. The Miami Heat is an interesting one just because they obviously have their history of development. They even have that whole, I'm pretty sure they have a program specifically related to weight. Like, are you X percentage body fat and so on. So the Heat could be the right franchise to help turn things around from him. However, his fit with Bam Adebayo is fucking awful. Unless Bam actually figured out how to shoot threes instead of just being a gimmick of a three-point shooter, then that's not really going to work. The Orlando Magic doesn't make sense with their forwards. Wouldn't it be funny if he went to Milwaukee? The Bucks are like, we'll get another forward who's really big and strong and finishes in the paint a lot. That'll make up for losing Giannis. It won't. Pacers have no reason to do something like that. The Detroit Pistons is interesting. Similar idea of a great point guard for him to get set up by. I do feel as though the Pistons are a worse spacing situation than that of the Hawks or the Charlotte Hornets, just because Cade Cunningham's three is not as reliable as Trae or LaMelo's, but I think that would be cool as well. Also, don't think you'd have to give up too much. I don't think you'd have to give up too much in any of these trades. The Chicago Bulls, I would also find this very interesting. I am pretty disinvested in the Bulls at this point, so I am kind of at a place where I'm like, I left that fan on. Hopefully it wasn't too loud. I am at a place where I'm just like, fuck it. Let's just do some weird shit. And trading for Zion would certainly be some weird shit. Him and Josh Giddey would be good in the fast break. I think their half-court offensive combination would be nightmarish, but you know, we'd get some fun lobs out of it. I'd actually have a player on the Bulls who I find exciting to watch, besides for Buzelis, who's basically the only guy. I will say, though, if Buzelis was in that trade, that might be the final straw. If the Bulls traded Buzelis after that rookie year, that might be it for me. caring at all about the Bulls, but I would not blame them at all for getting in on this sweepstakes, given that they seem to be interested in being competitive, given that it's the East, so it's really easy to be competitive, and given that you don't have to trade that much to actually make it happen. However, in order for that to happen, the Bulls would have to be the type of team that trades for a star player and doesn't trade their star player after years of passing where they should have traded their star player. The Celtics are going to retool a lot. I don't think they're going to go in that direction. I don't think the Brooklyn Nets are going to go in that direction. Zion has been tied to the New York Knicks since before he was even in the NBA. However, though I did use him for that nice little clickbaity thumbnail, I just don't think he's going to end up as a New York Knick. It doesn't really make sense for his side of things. It doesn't really make sense for the Pelicans because the Knicks are not going to be able to offer shit nor fuck for Zion. They're not going to be able to offer anything. So, I mean, maybe OG or Bridges is enough and you just say flip those guys for picks or something. But no, I don't think that's going to happen. The Philadelphia 76ers, who knows what the hell that franchise is going to do. The Raptors, I don't think their wings pair well with Zion at all. So that's not the direction that I would go. And then we're going to move on to the Western Conference real quick, although there's significantly less teams that it makes sense for. Don't think the Nuggets make sense. The Trailblazers could maybe be interesting, but I think they're pretty happy going with their straight up standard rebuild, and I would prefer to see them stick in that direction. The Warriors would be interesting, but you would absolutely have to trade Draymond Green. Under no circumstances do you have Jimmy Butler, Draymond Green, and Zion Williamson on the floor at the same time. That's just a disaster. That's only going to be a disaster. The Clippers, I don't really think so. The Lakers, nah. Even though it would add a really, really fun dynamic to that offense. Because, God, think of the fast break offense with LeBron, Luka, and Zion. Are you fucking kidding me? That would be so fun. But I don't really think it's something that they would do. Then again, this is the Lakers, and they love to make the star player swing. I just don't know if this is an instance where it makes a lot of sense. Phoenix, I don't know, maybe that's their out. Maybe that's their way, because I just recorded a video about them not trading Devin Booker. Maybe Zion is their way of being like, nah, we can get another star next to Devin Booker. This would be the way to do it. If you want to take a high risk, but also higher reward swing, the Phoenix Suns are the team that actually makes sense to do something like that. They're in that position of desperation while still trying to be good, while also not having much in the asset category, that I think they could make it work. Maybe you even see a Kevin Durant, Zion Williamson 3-team trade where a third team is getting Kevin Durant and the Pelicans are getting back some of the assets from the Kevin Durant trade, and then Zion Williamson is heading to Phoenix. That is interesting. That I just talked that out loud, and now I actually think it's a real possibility that makes a good amount of sense. So Phoenix is actually pretty high up on my list right now. Sacramento, it'd be really funny. It'd be really fucking funny if the Kings traded for Zion, but I don't think that's going to happen. The Dallas Mavericks, no. Defense wins championships. Houston Rockets, nah, I don't think so on that one either. Memphis Grizzlies, maybe. I do think Jaren Jackson as a 5 next to him could be cool. Some very Brooke Lopez to his Giannis. However, I think there's a lot of volatile factors with the Grizzlies right now. I wouldn't throw another major source of volatility in there as well. However, Ja and Zion being on the same team would be one of the more interesting potential outcomes here, given the draft pick stuff, how much the last couple of years, the discussion for both of those players has been about how one should have been drafted over the other. That's interesting, but yeah. No, I wouldn't recommend that. And then finally, the Spurs. If the Spurs were on some real have my cake and maybe eat it too shit, they could say, we're using the number 2 pick on Ace Bailey or whoever they may choose. I don't know much about this year's draft, but we still have enough assets to trade for Zion to be essentially just like our shitty alternative to a Giannis or Kevin Durant trade. Plus, he's younger, so if he does end up turning things around. And then I also just can't imagine a better fit for a 5 next to Zion than Victor fucking Wembanyama. So, yeah, That is something that I'm very I think is something that's also in the back pocket. I think that's something that makes sense. So, for my top 2 teams out of each conference, and my top 2 teams really in general, is the Atlanta Hawks and Charlotte Hornets, because I think it just makes sense for them in the position that they're in to make this kind of a desperation move. Will it work out? Probably not. Will it result in some fun highlights that gets them to sell some more tickets, at least initially? I would say so. I would say that's very reasonably possible. They're in a position that makes a lot of sense to do it. If I had to pick a third team in the East to trade for them, I actually might go the Chicago Bulls. And mind you, that is not me being a homer and being like, oh yeah, the Bulls should get Zion. I don't even think that's really a smart move necessarily, but they haven't been making smart moves anyway, so might as well just add a weird one on top of all the other weird ones. And then in the Western Conference, I would like to see him on the San Antonio Spurs, and then I think the Phoenix Suns make a lot of sense. I think the Phoenix Suns make a lot of sense. If you're trying to get another star next to Devin Booker, but you don't have real assets to do it, this is the way to do it. It actually makes a lot of sense. And wow, am I calling that shit live? This shit just said no connection. Did I just record all on a black screen? It's been a black screen for a minute at the very least. Whatever, video done.